I used to think parenting was simple math. You raise a child the way you were raised, add a little modern improvement, subtract obvious mistakes, and somehow it all balances out. It doesn't, because there's something nobody tells you early enough. Most families are not just passing down love and values, they are passing down reactions, patterns, emotional reflexes, the way voices rise when tension enters a room, the way silence suddenly becomes a punishment, the way I'm fine can mean absolutely anything except fine. And the strange part is, you don't notice it while it's happening. You just call it normal. I remember watching younger parents, and even myself at some point, repeat sentences that sounded exactly like something they swore they would never say. It wasn't even a choice. It was like something in the background took over the moment frustration entered the room. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. Most of us are not actively raising children in real time. We are replaying old recordings of how we were raised. And unless something interrupts that playback, it keeps going. Clean, automatic, generational. But here's where it gets interesting. The moment you start noticing it is the moment it stops being automatic. And that is where the real work begins. The first real crack in the cycle rarely looks dramatic. It's not some cinematic moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It usually looks like a pause, a small, uncomfortable hesitation right after you've said something to a child and immediately feel it land wrong in your own chest. Because generational patterns don't announce themselves, they repeat quietly until awareness walks into the room. From a psychological standpoint, this is where something called implicit learning shows its full power. As children, we don't just learn rules, we absorb emotional strategies. We learn what anger looks like in adults, what silence means after conflict, what discipline feels like on the nervous system. These aren't lessons we can easily recall. They become reflexes stored deeper than language. So later in life, especially under stress, the brain doesn't think its way into parenting responses, it retrieves them. That's why a parent can promise themselves, I will not shout, and still find their voice rising before they even notice the decision has been made. The nervous system recognizes tension and pulls from the most familiar survival template it has. And this is where things get emotionally complicated. Because in the moment after the reaction, awareness kicks in. You see your child's face change. You see the confusion or withdrawal. And suddenly, you are not just a parent in a moment of discipline, you are also a witness to your own inheritance. That's the unsettling part. You'll begin to realize some of your reactions did not originate with you. But awareness alone is not enough to break anything. In fact, it can make things worse at first. Because now you are no longer just reacting, you are reacting and judging yourself for reacting. That double layer creates guilt, and guilt often pushes people right back into the same patterns, just faster and quieter next time. I've seen this play out repeatedly. A parent recognizes the cycle, feels ashamed, tries harder, gets overwhelmed, and then slips back into the exact same emotional shortcuts they were trying to escape. Not because they don't care, but because the brain, under emotional pressure, always prefers familiarity over intention. And that is the first real trap of breaking generational cycles. You don't just fight the old behavior, you also fight the emotional weight of realizing it exists in you at all. And this is usually where most people underestimate the process. They think awareness should immediately translate into control. It doesn't. In fact, awareness often makes things feel messier before they get better. Because once you start noticing your own patterns, you begin to catch yourself mid reaction. You hear your tone shift, you feel your patience snap faster than you intended, and instead of feeling in control, you start feeling exposed to yourself. This is where the real psychological friction begins, the gap between intention and automatic response. Neuroscience explains this quite clearly. The brain's emotional systems, especially those involved in threat detection, activate faster than the rational decision making parts of the brain. So, in moments of stress, frustration, or perceived disrespect, the body reacts before logic even gets a chance to speak. That's why people often say, I don't know what came over me. It wasn't something coming over them, it was something already built in. And here's the uncomfortable truth: breaking cycles does not start with perfect behavior, it starts with interrupted behavior. That interruption is small but powerful. A moment where instead of following the old script all the way through, you catch it halfway. Maybe your voice is already rising, but you pause. Maybe you feel the urge to shut down and go silent, but you stay present for just a few seconds longer. Those moments don't look impressive from the outside, but internally, they are structural changes. Because every time you interrupt an automatic response, you weaken its authority. You tell your nervous system this is no longer the only available path. Of course, it doesn't feel smooth. In the beginning, it feels unnatural, almost like you're doing parenting without instincts. And that's where a lot of people panic and go back to what feels effortless, even if it's unhealthy. But effortlessness is not the goal, awareness is. And slowly, something shifts. The reaction doesn't disappear overnight, but the pause starts to appear earlier. The regret becomes less intense. The repair afterward becomes more intentional instead of reactive. That's when you realize something important. You are not trying to erase where you came from. You are trying to stop it from being the only thing that drives where you go next. The part nobody really prepares you for is what happens when people around you start noticing the change. Because breaking a generational cycle doesn't stay personal for long, it becomes visible, and not everyone reacts comfortably to that. In many family systems, behavior is not just behavior, it's tradition. So when you start responding differently, speaking more calmly, refusing to escalate conflict, setting boundaries without aggression, it can feel to others like you are rejecting the system itself. Not necessarily because they are against you, but because familiarity feels like correctness to them. This is where things get psychologically layered. Family members may start interpreting your changes in ways that are not about you at all. You've changed. You're becoming distant. You think you're better now. These statements are often less about your actions and more about their discomfort with disrupted expectations. And that pressure can be subtle but powerful. Because human beings are wired for belonging, and belonging often comes with invisible rules: how loudly you should speak, how quickly you should forgive, how much emotional space you're allowed to take. So, when you stop following those unwritten rules, even in healthy ways, it can create tension. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of cycle breaking. It can feel like disconnection before it feels like healing. And that emotional phase is where many people retreat. They start thinking, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this is just how families are. Not because they are wrong, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and old patterns offer instant belonging even when they cost emotional stability. But here's the deeper psychological shift. When you maintain new patterns long enough, something changes in the environment too. Children, especially, respond quickly to consistency. They don't need perfection, they need predictability. When reactions become less explosive, when conversations include explanation instead of just correction, when emotional recovery happens instead of emotional shutdown, their nervous systems adjust. They begin to expect stability instead of volatility, and that expectation becomes their new normal. That is the quiet success most people don't notice immediately. There is no applause for fewer arguments, no celebration for calmer communication. But internally, something fundamental is being rewritten. Still, it doesn't come without cost, because choosing a new pattern often means standing slightly outside the emotional habits of the people around you, and that can feel lonely at times. But that loneliness is not emptiness, it is transition. It is what happens when you are no longer fully inside the old system, but not yet fully recognized in the new one. And that space, uncomfortable as it is often where real change finally stabilizes. What happens next is the part most people only understand in hindsight. Because after the resistance, after the awkward adjustment period, after the emotional pushback from both inside and outside the family system, something quieter starts to emerge. Stability. Not the dramatic kind, not the everything is perfect now version people imagine, but a more subtle psychological shift where the emotional temperature of the home stops swinging so violently. And at first, it almost feels suspicious. Many people don't recognize peace when they've grown up around unpredictability, so calm communication can feel like something is missing. Silence doesn't feel safe yet, it feels unfamiliar. Even healthy boundaries can initially trigger guilt, as if something has been left incomplete. This is where the brain's conditioning shows itself again. The nervous system doesn't immediately trust new environments, it tests them repeatedly. It waits for the old pattern to return. But when it doesn't return consistently, something important begins to happen: relearning. From a developmental psychology perspective, this is where co regulation becomes visible. Children and even adults in the system start adjusting their emotional responses based on the new baseline they experience repeatedly. If conflict no longer escalates into chaos, the body stops preparing for chaos. It sounds simple, but it is actually profound. The nervous system recalibrates its expectations of relationships, and that changes behavior in ways that don't always look obvious at first. Fewer defensive reactions, less emotional shutdown, more willingness to communicate without fear of explosion. These shifts are gradual, but they are structurally significant. Meanwhile, the person breaking the cycle often goes through their own internal recalibration too, because something else starts to surface: clarity. You begin to see your past not as a fixed identity, but as a learned system. And that distinction is powerful. It removes the illusion that this is just who we are and replaces it with something more accurate. This is what we learned, and it can be unlearned. But clarity also brings responsibility, because once you've seen the pattern clearly, you can't unknow it. You become accountable not only for your reactions, but for what you choose to repeat moving forward. And that responsibility is where transformation actually stabilizes. Not in the moment of insight, not in the emotional breakthrough, but in the repeated, unglamorous decision to respond differently when it would have been easier not to. That is where the cycle actually starts to lose its grip, not because it disappears overnight, but because it slowly stops being automatic. And once something is no longer automatic, it is no longer in control. What often comes after this stage is the part that feels the most emotionally conflicting, because now you're no longer just changing behavior, you're starting to redefine identity inside a system that still remembers the old version of you, and systems resist redefinition. At this point, many people expect external validation to confirm that they are doing the right thing. But in reality, what they often get instead is mixed feedback. Some people respond positively to the calmer communication, while others interpret it as distance, stubbornness, or even disrespect. So you end up standing in a strange psychological middle ground, internally shifting, externally debated. This is where differentiation of self becomes a useful lens. In family systems theory, differentiation refers to the ability to maintain your emotional identity while staying connected to others, without being pulled entirely into their emotional reactivity. In practical terms, it means you can hear someone's disappointment without automatically absorbing it as your failure. You can set a boundary without needing everyone to approve of it. You can remain present without becoming emotionally hijacked. But this skill is not natural at first. It is developed through repetition under pressure. And pressure is exactly what tends to show up. Old dynamics often try to reassert themselves indirectly through guilt, nostalgia, or emotional comparison. You used to be easier to talk to. things were better before you started changing. These statements are rarely about facts. They are about emotional equilibrium being disrupted. Because when one person changes their patterns, it forces the entire system to adjust, and systems don't like adjusting. So the challenge becomes consistency without escalation. You don't argue your way into legitimacy. You don't defend every misunderstanding. You simply maintain the new pattern long enough that it becomes undeniable through repetition rather than explanation. This is where emotional endurance matters more than emotional intensity, because intensity fades quickly, endurance compounds. And somewhere in this phase, something quietly shifts again. You stop needing the old system to fully approve of your new behavior in order to continue it. That is a turning point. Not because conflict disappears, but because internal permission becomes stronger than external resistance. And once that happens, the cycle no longer has emotional leverage over you in the same way. It can still echo, it can still attempt to pull you back, but it can no longer define the direction you move in. At some point, you realize something simple but profound. You are no longer living inside the cycle. You are only occasionally passing by its echoes. The reactions that once felt automatic start to feel optional. The emotional storms that used to define entire days begin to shrink into brief moments that can be noticed, named, and let go without escalation. And most importantly, you stop confusing familiarity with correctness. That shift changes everything. Because breaking generational cycles was never really about becoming a better version of anyone else's expectations. It was about interrupting repetition long enough for something new to take root, something calmer, more intentional, more emotionally literate. And yes, it costs something. It asks for patience when instinct wants speed. It asks for restraint when emotion wants expression. It asks for consistency when comfort tries to pull you back into what is familiar. But over time, what it gives back is structure, emotional structure, relational structure, and eventually a different kind of peace. Not the kind that comes from avoiding conflict, but the kind that comes from not being controlled by it. And if there is one truth that quietly ties all of this together, it is this: cycles do not end because someone declares them over. They end because someone repeatedly chooses a different response long enough for a new pattern to become the norm. So when you look at your own reactions now, the ones that are slower, more considered, less inherited, you are not just witnessing personal growth. You are witnessing a line being rewritten in real time. And somewhere down that line, someone else will experience life differently because of it. That's how cycles actually break.